We get a lot of inquiries via email or calls about, I want to test for CIRS, what is the process? And it is not a black and white answer, because number one, we need to figure out together whether testing you for CIRS is the way to go. Or if we need to look at something else, because what we don't want to be doing is testing for anything and everything and hoping that something will show up and that you are, a few £1,000 poorer. But in testing for CIRS, we would always start with a VCS test. The VCS test, along with the 37 cluster symptom questionnaire, is a really helpful, well-documented, evidenced way to screen an individual for CIRS. So it costs $15. So this is as affordable as it's going to be in terms of testing. Always start with a VCS test, unless you have a reason that you cannot take the test. Something with your eyesight, if your child is under 10, but otherwise start with the VCS test. From there, you need to be aware that not everybody with switched on CIRS will fail the test. So looking at the test and looking at the symptoms together is very important. Some people will have a past VCS test from the very first time whilst they are in exposure, if mold is one of those triggers for their CIRS, and whilst they are at their sickest, but they can still pass the test. So the test is not a 100% you're dealing with CIRS or you're not, but it's a really good entry point. The symptoms in many ways are more relevant, because if we're seeing a range of symptoms that seem to affect different parts of the body, different systems, again, we are thinking that there is widespread inflammation, which is what CIRS is. Of course, there are other causes for widespread inflammation outside of CIRS. So going through those symptoms, that questionnaire with your practitioner, and really for your practitioner to really understand what the symptoms mean, those ones that you said yes to, what do they look like? What about the symptoms that you said no to? Are you sure, do you understand the symptom? Next, what I like to do is do the HLA, looking at your genetic susceptibility, and it's a mouth swab. So again, as far as testing goes, doing your genetic test is fairly affordable, and you don't require a blood draw. So it's fairly easy. Everybody can do this. Children can do this. And it tells us whether or not CIRS is even on the cards for you, because without the genetic predisposition, it is highly unlikely that you would be suffering with CIRS. A positive HLA does not mean that you are suffering with CIRS. It tells us, it sort of builds a little bit more evidence to our case that we may be dealing with CIRS, because your genetics have you potentially set up for it. And then we can do the full biomarkers, we can do the full blood panel. The only problem with this in the UK is that it is still really expensive. So at the time of doing this video, a full panel, including all the biomarkers that we ideally want to be including if investing in this test, will take you to about £2,000. So the reality is that we are working and having the discussion together, myself and the client. How do we proceed with the information that we are gathering, looking at your symptoms, looking at your timeline? Does it make sense to proceed assuming? Do we want to test further? At what point do we test? Do we test right away? Do we test later down the line? So then this is where the conversation becomes more personalized. And I can't never answer somebody via email or in that initial short discovery call what those best steps are going to be for that person. I'm going to need to know so much more about you and your history to then determine with you the best way to go. But there are options to test in the UK. All are available, and so those are discussed with you on a case-by-case basis. The other test that is also helpful for CIRS as we are moving and progressing along the steps of the protocol is MARCoNS, that particular type of bacteria that can feed into this ongoing inflammatory picture. MARCoNS is a nasal swab. Again, really easily done, affordable, can be done in the UK from home, can be done anywhere in the world, really. So again, not a problem. And that is something that I always do if we are suspecting CIRS or if we have CIRS confirmed. And then, of course, when we talk about CIRS, we're talking about more than molds. We're talking about infections. When do we test for what? Lyme disease, Bartonella, other infections. My answer is more often than not, you do not want to test for these infections from the get-go, because when the immune system is really dysregulated, you are likely to be getting inaccurate test results, whether it be false negatives or false positives. And I can't quite get into the why in this video here to try to keep it as short as I can. But testing for infections, if we are strongly suspecting that they may be part of your web, is not done from the get-go. It will, though, be a consideration a little bit later on. And again, there is no perfect test for those infections. So it's about weighing the pro and the con and see where we're at and making an informed decision. What about your environment? Again, if we go back for a moment to the topic of mold, which accounts for the majority of CIRS cases, testing the environment is really important. But there is no, just like Lyme and co-infections, there is no perfect test to test your environment. If we see mold, we know that it's there. We don't need to test. Molds are releasing biotoxins in the environment. You are getting exposed. We know that it's there. I'm talking about those cases where we don't know. We don't know what your CIRS may have been triggered by, or your suspected CIRS. Is there something at home? There is no clear anything, no smell, nothing, no history of a leak, nothing. Where do we go from there? And this is where you might want to be considering a ERMI or HUTSMI2 test. But again, there are conflicting takes on home testing by companies that do that come and they assess your home. So the bottom line is that there is no perfect test, and we can only try to get a sense for what may be going on at home, accepting that every test has its limitations. When I work with a client, I often connect clients with particular companies that can come to your home and do a thorough assessment. They can investigate, they can actually look places that you can't have access to. So there is always that option. I recommend against fogging for many reasons. I'm not going to get into this, but you really want to get to the bottom of what is going on with the home. If you can see the problem, if you can see the mold, get to the bottom of it. Don't just clean it and fog and think that that's it. If you can't see any issues, but you've been poorly, we are suspecting or we have confirmed CIRS, we need to know that you're in a safe environment. And how do we do this? Again, a conversation needs to happen. It's about COVID. COVID is another now clear trigger for CIRS, and there is no, some triggers have been and gone, and what you're left with is the aftermath of the immune dysregulation. So in many ways, those long COVID cases are more straightforward, but often it's long COVID with a mold exposure, or it's long COVID of a past exposure to Borrelia, and they have had chronic Lyme, which they have not realized. So whilst there is no perfect steps or set steps that we are walking through, but just to understand that there are options and to understand that testing needs to be discussed in the consultation once myself or your practitioner has fully prepared for that consultation and understands your case as much as they can. We really can't advise on testing without knowing anything about you. I hope that makes sense.